In the heart of a glittering Columbus ballroom, Caitlin Wells stood radiant in her wedding gown, but her smile hid a tremor of dread. The clink of champagne glasses filled the air as Daniel, her new husband, raised a toast to their future, his eyes gleaming with a charm that had once swept her off her feet. Then, tucked beneath a napkin, she found it. A scrawled note, its words slicing through her joy. "He's not who you think." Her pulse raced, the room spinning as she scanned the crowd, faces blurring into masks of celebration. Was it a cruel prank, or had Daniel's promises been a lie? She clutched the note, her fingers shaking, as his hand brushed hers, warm yet suddenly foreign. The music swelled, but Caitlin felt alone, trapped in a moment that should have been hers. What had she missed in his flawless facade? And who knew the truth enough to warn her now, on the day she'd given him everything? The answer lay hidden, but one thing was clear. Her dream was unraveling, and the real nightmare was just beginning. In the crowded banquet hall of a modest restaurant in downtown Columbus, Ohio, Caitlin Wells stood frozen, her heart pounding beneath the delicate lace of her wedding dress. The clinking of glasses and laughter of guests faded into a dull roar as her eyes locked onto a small folded note tucked beneath a napkin on the head table. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, the words scrawled in hurried ink slicing through her joy like a blade. He had lied to her from the start. The revelation hit her like a wave, threatening to drown the happiness she had clung to for months. She forced a smile, her gaze darting across the room, searching for him among the sea of faces, but he was nowhere to be seen. The weight of betrayal settled in her chest, heavy and suffocating, as she realized the day she had dreamed of was unraveling before her eyes. Caitlin had spent the past year building a life she thought was secure. At 30, she had poured everything into her small flower shop, a quaint storefront on a bustling street in Columbus, inherited from her mother. The shop was her refuge, a place where she could coax beauty from chaos, even after her father's bankruptcy left her family in ruins. She had met Daniel, a charming financier with a disarming smile, at a local business networking event in the spring of 2022. His confidence and promises of stability had drawn her in, filling the void left by years of struggle. He spoke of a future together, one where her shop could thrive and her worries would fade. She had believed him, letting her guard down as he wove himself into her life, convincing her that love could mend what loss had broken. The wedding had been planned quickly, a whirlwind of decisions driven by Daniel's insistence that they seize the moment. Caitlin had hesitated at first, her practical nature urging caution, but his enthusiasm was infectious. She had agreed to a small ceremony, trusting his assurances that he would handle the details. The restaurant, with its warm wooden floors and soft lighting, had felt like the perfect choice, a reflection of her understated dreams. She had spent weeks arranging the flowers herself, weaving roses and lilies into centerpieces that mirrored her hope for a new beginning. Now, standing among those blooms, she felt their beauty mock her. The note in her hand was a jagged tear in the fabric of her trust, its words echoing in her mind as she tried to piece together what they meant. She recalled the moments leading up to the discovery, searching for signs she might have missed. Daniel had been attentive, almost too perfect, in the weeks before the wedding. He had taken an interest in her business, asking about her finances with a curiosity that she had mistaken for care. She had shared her books with him, proud of the modest success she had carved out despite her father's debts. He had suggested merging their accounts after the wedding, framing it as a step toward their shared future. She had agreed, lulled by his promises, unaware of the shadows lurking behind his words. The memory of his hand on hers, signing papers she barely skimmed, now filled her with dread. Had she been blind, or had he crafted his deception so carefully that no one could have seen it coming? The reception continued around her, oblivious to her turmoil. Guests raised toasts, their voices a distant hum as Caitlin's mind raced. She slipped the note into her pocket, its sharp edges pressing against her skin, a constant reminder of the truth she couldn't yet face. She moved through the crowd, her steps mechanical, as she searched for Daniel. He had stepped out just before the note appeared, claiming a quick call with a client. His absence now felt deliberate, a calculated move to leave her alone with her discovery. She scanned the room, her eyes lingering on the faces of friends and family, wondering if any of them knew more than they let on. The weight of their smiles pressed against her, each one a reminder of how deeply she had trusted, how fully she had given herself to a man who might have betrayed her. Her thoughts drifted to the shop, the one constant in her life. It had been her anchor through her father's downfall, a place where she could rebuild what had been lost. She had poured her savings into keeping it afloat, refusing to let it crumble as her family had. Daniel had praised her resilience, but now she wondered if he had seen her shop as something else, a resource to exploit. The thought twisted in her gut, a sickening realization that the man she had married might have targeted her not for love, but for what she had built. She remembered his late-night calls, the ones he brushed off as work, and the way his eyes darted away when she asked too many questions. The pieces were falling into place, each one sharper than the last. As the evening wore on, Caitlin's unease grew. She excused herself from the guests, retreating to a quiet corner of the restaurant where she could think. The note burned in her pocket, its words a riddle she couldn't yet solve. She considered confronting Daniel the moment he returned, but something held her back, a fear that the truth might be worse than she imagined. She needed answers, but she also needed time to understand what she was up against. The restaurant's warmth, once comforting, now felt stifling, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She stepped outside, the cool autumn air of Columbus biting at her skin, grounding her for a moment. The city stretched out before her, its lights a stark contrast to the darkness settling in her heart. She walked a few steps, her heels clicking against the pavement, when her phone buzzed in her clutch. She hesitated, her breath catching as she pulled it out. The screen glowed with a message from an unknown number, a single image attached. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she opened it, revealing a photo of her flower shop, its windows dark under the night sky. Below the image, a caption sent a chill through her. "You're next." The words hung in the air, a threat she couldn't ignore, as the distant sound of laughter from the restaurant faded behind her. Caitlin Wells sat alone in the dim light of her Columbus apartment, the weight of her wedding ring pressing against her finger like a shackle she couldn't remove. The silence of the small space was deafening, a stark contrast to the laughter and music that had filled the restaurant just 2 nights ago in late October of 2022. Her eyes traced the outlines of the furniture, each piece chosen with care during brighter days, now seeming to mock her with their familiarity. The note from the reception, its cryptic words burned into her memory, lay crumpled on the coffee table, a silent accusation that Daniel, her new husband, had betrayed her. She felt hollow, as if the life she had built was slipping through her fingers, leaving her stranded in a reality she didn't recognize. The days following the wedding had blurred into a haze of doubt and discovery. Caitlin had woken the morning after the reception to find Daniel already gone, his suitcase missing from their shared bedroom. He had left a brief message on her phone, claiming an urgent business trip to Chicago, promising to return in a few days. His absence, once a minor inconvenience, now loomed like a deliberate escape. She had replayed their months together, searching for cracks in the facade he had presented. Daniel had entered her life when she was most vulnerable, after her father's bankruptcy had left her scrambling to keep her flower shop afloat. His charm had been a lifeline, his promises of partnership a balm to her fears. She had trusted him, shared her dreams and her ledgers, believing his interest was rooted in love. Now, she wondered if every gesture had been calculated, every smile a step in a plan she hadn't seen coming. Driven by a growing unease, Caitlin had visited her shop that morning, a quaint corner store on High Street, its windows lined with vases of roses and daisies. The familiar scent of blooms usually steadied her, but today it did little to ease the knot in her chest. She had pulled up her business accounts on the shop's aging computer, her fingers hesitating over the keys. What she found confirmed her worst fears. A withdrawal of several $1,000s, siphoned from her business account just days before the wedding. The transaction bore her digital signature, but she had no memory of authorizing it. Her breath caught as she scrolled through the records, each line a betrayal etched in numbers. Daniel had insisted on helping with the shop's finances, citing his expertise, and she had let him, too tired to question his motives. The realization that he had used her trust against her stung deeper than she could have imagined. She thought back to the early days of their courtship, when Daniel had seemed like the answer to her unspoken prayers. He had appeared at her shop one rainy afternoon, offering to buy flowers for a client, his easy confidence drawing her in. Over coffee, he had listened to her stories of struggle, nodding as she spoke of her father's failed investments and the debts that lingered like shadows. He had promised to help her grow the business, to make it a name in Columbus. She had been cautious at first, scarred by her family's losses, but his persistence wore her down. Within months, she had shared everything, her hopes, her fears, her bank details. Now, sitting in her apartment, she saw those moments in a new light, each one a thread in a web she hadn't noticed until it was too late. The city outside her window buzzed with life, its sounds muffled by the walls that felt both protective and confining. Caitlin's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of Daniel's behavior. She remembered his late-night calls, the ones he took in another room, his voice low and guarded. She had brushed them off, chalking them up to work stress, but now they seemed like clues to a truth he had kept hidden. The note from the wedding, with its vague warning, gnawed at her. Who had left it? Someone who knew Daniel's secrets, someone who wanted her to see the truth. She considered calling her best friend Sarah, but hesitated, unsure who she could trust. The guests at the wedding had been a mix of her friends and Daniel's colleagues, their faces now blurring into a gallery of potential accomplices. Caitlin stood, pacing the small living room, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. She needed to act, to reclaim control before Daniel returned and spun another lie. She thought of her shop, the one thing she had fought to preserve through every hardship. It was more than a business. It was her mother's legacy, a testament to resilience. Losing it to Daniel's deception was unthinkable. She sat at her desk, pulling out a notebook to list what she knew. The missing money, the note, Daniel's sudden trip. Each fact was a weight, pressing her toward a decision. She could confront him when he returned, but without proof, he might slip away, leaving her with nothing. She needed to dig deeper, to find the source of his betrayal before it consumed everything she had built. Her thoughts were interrupted by a memory of her father, his face lined with worry as he explained his failed ventures. He had trusted the wrong people, signed papers without reading them, and paid the price. Caitlin had sworn never to repeat his mistakes, yet here she was, ensnared by her own blind faith. The irony cut deep, fueling her resolve to fight back. She considered checkingles she could hire someone to trace the transaction, but her funds were already stretched thin, and the idea of involving strangers felt risky. She needed an ally, someone who knew Daniel's world, but the thought of reaching out to his colleagues filled her with dread. They might be part of his scheme, closing ranks to protect him. As night fell, Caitlin's apartment grew darker, the shadows stretching across the walls like fingers reaching for her. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, the chill of the season seeping into her bones. She thought of closing the shop temporarily, protecting it from further damage, but abandoning it felt like surrender. She couldn't let Daniel win, not after everything she had sacrificed. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, each second a reminder that time was slipping away. She stood at the window, watching the street below, half expecting to see Daniel's car pull up, his smile ready to disarm her. The emptiness of the road mirrored the void in her heart, a loneliness that threatened to swallow her whole. She was about to turn away when a sharp knock echoed through the apartment, startling her. Her pulse raced as she approached the door, her hand hovering over the knob. No one visited this late, not without calling first. She peered through the peephole, but the hallway was empty, the light flickering faintly. Cautiously, she opened the door a crack, her breath catching as she spotted a plain envelope on the mat, her name written in unfamiliar handwriting. She snatched it up, locking the door behind her, her fingers trembling as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet, a copy of a marriage contract dated weeks before their wedding, her signature scrawled at the bottom, a signature she had never made. Caitlin Wells clutched the forged marriage contract, her breath shallow as the weight of its implications crashed over her like a tidal wave. In the quiet of her Columbus apartment, the document's stark lines and her own name, scrawled in a hand that wasn't hers, felt like a noose tightening around her future. It was early November of 2022, and the city outside hummed with the rhythm of a new day, oblivious to the storm raging within her. The realization that her signature had been used to bind her to unknown debts or schemes shook her to her core, threatening to unravel everything she had fought to preserve. Her flower shop, her mother's legacy, and her own sense of self hung in the balance, and she knew she couldn't afford to falter now. The discovery of the contract the previous night had left Caitlin sleepless, her mind racing through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. She had spent hours staring at the paper, tracing the curves of the forged signature, searching for a clue to its origin. Daniel, her husband of less than a week, had vanished on his so-called business trip, leaving her to untangle the web he had spun. The missing money from her shop's account, the cryptic note at their wedding, and now this contract pointed to a betrayal far deeper than she had imagined. She thought back to their whirlwind courtship, how he had eased into her life with promises of security. Every memory now felt tainted, as if his every word had been a step toward this moment. She had trusted him, shared her vulnerabilities, and he had turned them against her with surgical precision. Determined to act, Caitlin had decided to seek help. She drove through the crisp morning air of Columbus, the city's brick buildings and leafless trees blurring past her window. Her destination was the office of Henry Grayson, a lawyer who had been her father's friend before his bankruptcy shattered their family. Henry had always been a steady presence, offering advice when her shop faced hard times. She hoped he could make sense of the contract and guide her next steps. The office, tucked in a modest building near the Scioto River, smelled of old books and coffee, a grounding contrast to the chaos in her mind. She handed Henry the contract, watching his expression shift as he studied it. His confirmation came like a blow. The document made her liable for debts tied to Daniel's ventures, debts she hadn't known existed. The forged signature was convincing enough to hold up in court unless she could prove it wasn't hers, a task that seemed daunting without evidence. Caitlin's thoughts drifted to her father's downfall as she sat in Henry's office. He had trusted partners who betrayed him, signing deals that buried him in debt. She had vowed to be smarter, to protect what was hers, yet here she was, ensnared by the same kind of deception. The irony fueled her resolve, pushing her to dig deeper. She asked Henry about Daniel's finances, hoping for a lead, but he had little to offer beyond a warning to move carefully. Daniel's world, he said, was one of shadows and half-truths, and challenging it could bring consequences she wasn't prepared for. She left the office with more questions than answers, the contract folded in her purse like a ticking bomb. Back at her shop, Caitlin tried to focus on the day's orders, arranging bouquets with mechanical precision. The scent of lilies filled the air, but it couldn't soothe the dread pooling in her stomach. She locked the door during a lull, retreating to the back room where she kept her files. Rummaging through a drawer, she found a business card Daniel had once left behind, its sleek design marked with the name of a company she didn't recognize, Meridian Ventures. The card felt heavy in her hand, a tangible link to the secrets he had kept. She remembered him mentioning the company in passing, dismissing it as a minor investment, but now it seemed like a thread worth pulling. She tucked the card away, her pulse quickening at the thought of what it might reveal. As evening fell, Caitlin's phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source. Laura, a former colleague of Daniel's who had attended the wedding, had reached out, asking to meet. Caitlin hesitated, wary of trusting anyone tied to her husband, but Laura's message hinted at knowledge she couldn't ignore. They met at a small cafe near Ohio State University, the hum of students a backdrop to their tense exchange. Laura's guarded demeanor softened as she shared what she knew. Daniel had been involved in questionable deals at Meridian Ventures, using shell companies to move money. She had left the firm months ago, uneasy about its practices, but she'd heard whispers that Daniel had targeted Caitlin's shop as a front. Laura's words were a lifeline, offering Caitlin a glimpse of the truth, but they also deepened her fear. If Daniel was part of something larger, she was no longer just fighting him. She was up against a machine. Driving home, Caitlin felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. Laura's information gave her a direction, a way to fight back. She thought of her shop, its shelves lined with flowers she had chosen with care, and vowed to protect it at all costs. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, casting fleeting patterns that mirrored her swirling thoughts. She considered confronting Daniel when he returned, but Laura's warning about Meridian's reach made her cautious. She needed proof, something concrete to dismantle his lies before he could spin new ones. Her apartment came into view, its windows dark against the night sky, and she felt a pang of loneliness. The fight ahead would be hers alone, or so she thought. She parked and climbed the stairs, her steps heavy with exhaustion. As she reached her door, her phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet hallway. She answered, her heart racing as Laura's voice came through, trembling with urgency. The connection crackled, but the words were clear enough to send a chill through her. Laura knew who was behind Daniel's schemes, but someone was watching them both. Before Caitlin could process the warning, the call cut off, leaving her staring at the screen, the silence now a threat she couldn't escape. Caitlin Wells gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale against the dark leather as she navigated the rain-slicked streets of Columbus, Ohio, under a moonless sky in mid-November of 2022. Fear coiled in her chest, a tight knot that pulsed with every heartbeat, but beneath it burned a spark of defiance, urging her to fight for the truth. The city's neon lights blurred through the windshield, reflecting the chaos of her thoughts as she drove toward an uncertain destination, armed only with a name, Meridian Ventures, and a resolve to reclaim what Daniel, her husband of mere days, had stolen from her. The weight of his betrayal, from the forged contract to the drained shop accounts, pressed against her, but she refused to let it crush her spirit. The night felt alive with secrets as Caitlin replayed the events that had led her here. Laura's warning, delivered in a trembling voice over the phone, had confirmed her suspicions. Daniel was entangled in something far larger than a personal scheme. Meridian Ventures, the company tied to the business card she'd found, was no ordinary firm. It was a web of shadows, moving money through fronts like her flower shop. Laura had promised to send more details, but the call had ended abruptly, leaving Caitlin with a gnawing sense of danger. She had spent the day in her apartment, pacing between cups of cold coffee, piecing together what she knew. The forged marriage contract made her liable for debts she hadn't incurred, and the missing funds from her shop, several $1,000s, pointed to Daniel's calculated plan. She couldn't wait for him to return and spin new lies. She needed evidence now, before the noose tightened further. Her destination was a nondescript office park on the edge of Columbus, where Laura had said Meridian kept a satellite branch. Caitlin had hesitated, knowing the risk of walking into Daniel's world, but inaction felt like surrender. She had convinced Laura to meet her there after hours, hoping the cover of night would shield them. The plan was simple: find records linking Daniel to the shop's accounts, something to prove he'd used her as a pawn. She parked a block away, the lot empty except for a lone security light flickering in the distance. The air was sharp with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt as she slipped out of her car, a small flashlight tucked in her coat pocket. Her sneakers moved silently across the pavement, her breath visible in the November chill, each step a commitment to the fight she hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. The office building loomed ahead, its glass facade reflecting the city's faint glow. Caitlin's heart raced as she approached the side entrance Laura had described, a maintenance door left unlocked by a sympathetic janitor. She slipped inside, the hallway dim and silent, smelling of industrial cleaner. Her flashlight beam danced across tiled floors, guiding her to a suite marked with Meridian's logo. The door was ajar, a stroke of luck that felt almost too convenient. She hesitated, her mind flashing to her shop, its shelves of roses and lilies, her mother's dream that she'd sworn to protect. Daniel had seen it as a tool, a means to an end, and the thought fueled her courage. She stepped into the office, the air thick with the musty scent of paper and neglect. Inside, rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, their metal surfaces glinting faintly. Caitlin moved quickly, her fingers trembling as she pulled open drawers, scanning folders for anything tied to her shop or Daniel's name. She found contracts, invoices, and ledgers, their numbers blurring together until one caught her eye. A transfer dated 3 days before her wedding, routing funds from her business account to an offshore entity. Her signature, forged again, stared back at her, a mockery of her trust. She tucked the document into her bag, her pulse quickening. As she dug deeper, another file revealed Meridian's broader scheme. A network of small businesses, each used to launder money, their owners unaware until it was too late. Her shop was just one piece in a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. Laura arrived minutes later, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. She carried a USB drive, her contribution to their makeshift investigation, claiming it held emails implicating Daniel's superiors. Caitlin felt a surge of gratitude, tempered by the fear that Laura's involvement put them both at risk. They worked in silence, sorting through papers, their flashlight beams crossing like swords in a duel. The office felt like a trap waiting to spring, its quiet unnerving after the city's hum. Caitlin's thoughts drifted to her father, whose blind trust had cost him everything. She had promised herself she'd be different, yet Daniel had exploited the same vulnerability. The realization stung, but it also sharpened her focus. She wouldn't let history repeat itself. As they prepared to leave, Caitlin's hand brushed against a locked drawer, its resistance taunting her. She pried it open with a letter opener, revealing a slim folder labeled with her shop's name. Inside were emails between Daniel and an unknown contact, discussing her business as a clean front and outlining plans to drain it further after the wedding. The words cut deep, confirmation that her marriage had been a transaction, her love a commodity. She slipped the folder into her bag, her resolve hardening. She was no longer just a victim. She was a threat, armed with proof that could unravel Daniel's world. She turned to Laura, ready to leave, when a distant sound, a creak of the hallway floor, froze them both. They doused their lights, the darkness swallowing them as they waited, breathless, for whatever came next. Caitlin's mind raced, plotting escape routes, but the office offered few options. The evidence in her bag felt like a lifeline, but also a target, marking her as someone who knew too much. She thought of her shop, its doors locked against the night, and vowed to return to it whole. The creak came again, closer now, a deliberate step that echoed in the stillness. She grabbed Laura's arm, pulling her toward the door, but as they stepped into the hallway, Caitlin's flashlight caught a reflection in her car's rearview mirror. Parked across the street, a black sedan idled there, its driver obscured, watching them. Her stomach dropped as she realized someone had been tracking her every move, and they weren't about to let her walk away. Caitlin Wells stood in the familiar glow of her Columbus living room, her heart hammering as she faced Daniel, the man she had married only weeks ago in late October of 2022. The air between them crackled with unspoken truths, her fear masked by a steely resolve that had grown through nights of betrayal and discovery. His easy smile, once a comfort, now seemed a weapon, sharpened by the lies she had uncovered, forged contracts, stolen funds, and a scheme that used her flower shop as a pawn. She held her ground, her eyes locked on his, knowing this moment would decide whether she reclaimed her life or lost it to his deception forever. Daniel had returned that morning, his suitcase thudding against the hardwood floor as he stepped into their apartment, unaware of the storm waiting for him. Caitlin had spent the previous night in a haze of adrenaline, the documents from Meridian Ventures' office burning a hole in her bag. The evidence, emails, transfers, and ledgers, painted a damning picture. Daniel had orchestrated a plan to drain her shop's accounts, using her signature to shield his tracks in a broader money laundering operation. Laura, her unexpected ally, had risked everything to help gather those files, and Caitlin had entrusted her with copies, a safeguard against whatever came next. She had arranged this meeting deliberately, choosing the familiar terrain of her home to confront him, where every corner reminded her of the life she was fighting for. The living room, with its soft rugs and framed photos, felt like a stage for a reckoning. Caitlin had decorated it herself, each vase and cushion a testament to her resilience after her father's fall. Now, it was a battleground. She watched Daniel settle onto the couch, his posture relaxed, as if nothing had changed. She remembered their first date here, his laughter filling the space, and how she'd believed in a future together. Those memories stung, but they also fueled her. She had rehearsed this moment, planning to expose him without tipping her hand too soon. She moved to the kitchen counter, her bag nearby, the documents hidden but ready, a silent promise of justice. Caitlin's mind raced as she studied him, searching for cracks in his facade. He spoke of his trip, spinning tales of meetings and deals, his voice smooth as ever. She nodded, her face a mask, while her thoughts churned. The note from their wedding, the forged contract, the black sedan trailing her, all pointed to a truth he thought he'd buried. She recalled Laura's warning about Meridian's reach, how Daniel was a cog in a larger machine. Confronting him risked more than heartbreak. It could draw the eyes of those watching from the shadows. Yet she couldn't wait longer. Every day gave him a chance to tighten the noose around her shop, her legacy. She began subtly, asking about his work, probing for slips. His answers were practiced, but his eyes flickered when she mentioned her shop's finances. She pressed further, mentioning a bank alert about an odd transfer, watching his jaw tighten. The air grew heavy, the pretense fraying as she reached for her bag, pulling out the folder. She laid the documents on the table. Transfers, emails, her forged signature stark against the pages. His face changed, the charm slipping like a mask, revealing something colder beneath. She stood taller, her voice steady in her mind, recounting how she'd traced his lies, how Laura had helped, how the evidence could end him. She wanted him to feel the weight of his betrayal, to know she wasn't the fragile woman he'd targeted. Daniel's demeanor shifted, his ease giving way to something sharper. He leaned forward, his presence filling the room, but Caitlin didn't flinch. She thought of her mother, who'd taught her to nurture beauty from hardship, and her father, whose trust had cost him everything. She wouldn't repeat his mistakes. She mentioned Laura's contact with a reporter, a bluff to gauge him, and saw his hands clench. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as she pushed forward, detailing Meridian's schemes, her shop's role, and the consequences waiting. She had sent the files to a safe place, she said, ensuring they'd surface if anything happened to her. It was a gamble, but she needed him to believe she held the upper hand. The tension broke when headlights flashed through the window, tires crunching on the street below. Caitlin's pulse spiked, her thoughts flashing to the black sedan that had followed her nights ago. She kept her eyes on Daniel, wondering if he'd signaled someone, but his face showed no triumph, only a flicker of unease. She moved to the door, her hand on the knob, as footsteps echoed in the hall. She had called Laura earlier, asking her to alert a contact in law enforcement if the meeting went wrong. The knock came, sharp and insistent, and she opened it to find two officers, their badges glinting. They stepped inside, their presence a wall between her and Daniel, and began questioning him, citing fraud and conspiracy based on anonymous tips. Caitlin's breath caught. She hadn't expected it to move this fast. Daniel's composure cracked, his eyes darting to her, a mix of anger and something like fear. She stood back, the documents now in the officer's hands, her gamble paying off. She thought of her shop, its shelves of blooms waiting for her return, and felt a surge of triumph. She had faced him, turned his lies against him, and protected what was hers. The officers led him to the door, his steps heavy, but he paused, turning to her. His gaze held hers, a silent promise that this wasn't over, that the shadows he served might still reach for her. She met his stare, refusing to waver, but her victory felt fragile, edged with a new fear. As the door closed behind them, Caitlin sank onto the couch, the room silent except for the hum of the city outside. She had won this battle, but Daniel's parting look lingered, a reminder of the forces still lurking. Her shop was safe for now, but she wondered what Meridian might do to protect its secrets. She thought of Laura, hoping she was safe, and of the reporter who might carry the story forward. The fight wasn't over, but she was no longer alone. She had her strength, her mother's legacy, and a truth that could light the way. Yet as she locked the door, a chill settled over her, the echo of Daniel's final glance whispering that someone, somewhere, was still watching. Caitlin Wells stood before the glass door of her flower shop in Columbus, Ohio, her reflection framed by vases of lilies and roses that glowed under the soft light of a December morning in 2022. A quiet pride warmed her chest, mingling with the ache of Daniel's betrayal, his final words still haunting her thoughts weeks after his arrest. The shop, once a target of his schemes, now stood free of debt, a testament to her fight. But the victory felt bittersweet, shadowed by the fear that his world, Meridian Ventures and its unseen players, might not let her go so easily. She unlocked the door, stepping into the familiar scent of blooms, determined to build a future untainted by his lies. The weeks since the confrontation had been a whirlwind of endings and beginnings. Daniel's arrest, swift and public, had unraveled his carefully woven facade. The documents Caitlin had gathered, with Laura's help, had exposed his role in Meridian's money laundering operation, linking her shop to a network of fronts across Ohio. The police had acted on her evidence, and a local reporter, tipped off by Laura, had broken the story, turning Daniel's charm into a cautionary tale. Caitlin had watched the news from her apartment, her heart pounding as his face flashed across the screen, his trial set for the new year. She had expected relief, but instead felt a hollow ache, the weight of her trust in him lingering like a bruise. Her shop, her mother's legacy, had survived, but at a cost she was still measuring. She had made hard choices in the aftermath. The shop's accounts, drained by Daniel's transfers, needed rebuilding. Caitlin had sold a portion of the business to a local co-op, a decision that stung but freed her from the forged debts tied to the marriage contract. The money had stabilized her finances, allowing her to keep the doors open and the shelves stocked. She had spent long nights rearranging the shop, moving vases and scrubbing counters, as if cleaning could erase the past. Each bouquet she crafted felt like a small act of defiance, a reminder that she could create beauty from chaos. She thought of her parents, her mother's love for flowers, her father's fall to trusting the wrong people, and vowed to honor their lessons by forging her own path. Beyond the shop, Caitlin had found a new purpose. The ordeal had shown her how easily trust could be exploited, especially for women like her, balancing dreams and survival. She had started a workshop series at the shop, offering free classes on financial literacy for small business owners, particularly women who'd faced setbacks. Laura, now a close friend, had joined her, bringing her own insights from Meridian's underbelly. The first session, held in the shop's back room, had drawn a dozen attendees, their stories echoing Caitlin's. Partners who'd deceived, systems that failed. She had listened, her heart swelling with a sense of community she hadn't expected. The shop, once a solitary refuge, was becoming a beacon, its petals carrying hope beyond its walls. Caitlin's thoughts often returned to Daniel, not with longing, but with a need to understand. She remembered their early days, his laughter filling her apartment, and how she'd believed he saw her strength. The truth, that he'd targeted her vulnerability, had reshaped those memories into warnings. She had received a letter from him, slipped through her mailbox days after his arrest. Its words, scrawled in a hurried hand, spoke of regret, claiming he'd been pressured by Meridian's higher-ups. He asked for forgiveness, but she'd left it unanswered, folding it into a drawer like a relic of a life she'd outgrown. Forgiving him felt unnecessary. Her healing came from action, from rebuilding what he'd tried to take. The city outside her shop bustled with holiday preparations, strings of lights twinkling along High Street. Caitlin felt the season's promise, but also its weight. Laura had warned that Meridian's reach extended beyond Daniel, and though the firm's local office had shuttered, its shadow lingered. Caitlin had installed new locks on the shop, checked her accounts daily, and kept her phone close, half expecting another cryptic message. She thought of the black sedan that had trailed her, its driver a mystery she hadn't solved. The reporter's articles hinted at ongoing investigations, but no one had been charged beyond Daniel, leaving her to wonder who else watched from the edges. One afternoon, as she arranged a holiday display, a customer lingered, a woman in her 50s, her scarf pulled tight against the December chill. She asked about the workshops, her questions sharp, probing Caitlin's story. Caitlin answered carefully, sensing an undercurrent she couldn't place. The woman left with a single rose, but her gaze stayed with Caitlin, stirring unease. She brushed it off, focusing on the shop's steady hum, but the encounter gnawed at her. She had fought to reclaim her life, but the fight had taught her vigilance, a habit she couldn't shake. She looked at her reflection in the shop's window, seeing not just the woman she was, but the one she'd become. Stronger, wary, unbroken. As evening fell, Caitlin closed the shop, the jingle of the bell a quiet farewell to the day. She stepped into the cold, her breath visible in the air, and walked to her car, parked under a street lamp's glow. The city felt alive, its pulse steady, but her own was unsteady, tuned to threats she couldn't name. She thought of Laura, planning their next workshop, and of the women who'd shared their stories, each one a thread in a tapestry of resilience. She had won back her shop, her freedom, but the cost was a clarity that saw danger in every shadow. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed, a new message lighting the screen. It was from an unknown number, just 3 words. "You're not done." Her hand froze on the door, the night closing in, whispering that her triumph was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.